You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hi, I'm Emily MacLeod and I'm a PhD researcher at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. In this season of Research for the Real World, we're focusing on how research at IOE is developing to address important current issues related to teacher education, teachers and teaching. In this episode, I'm delighted to be talking to Dr. Alison Kitson. Alison is an Associate Professor in History Education at IOE. She first joined IOE in 2008 as a lecturer in education after previously working as a history teacher in secondary state schools. Since working in teacher education, Alison has held a number of roles including subject leader for history, deputy programme leader for the secondary PGCE, and faculty director of initial teacher education at IOE. Alison's research interests include the potential role of history education in fostering a deep understanding of the climate crisis and how to support teachers to respond to climate change in meaningful and constructive ways. Recently, she's been involved in the development of UCL's brand new Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, which launched last month, and she's now the Centre's Programme Director. Congratulations on the launch of that centre, Alison, and I look forward to hearing more about it in our discussion today. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
So before I ask you a bit more about your work now, it would be really great to know a bit more about you and find out how you came to be where you are now. So I mentioned in the introduction that you were a secondary history teacher. Can you start by telling our listeners a bit more about your own education and background?
Sure. So, I went to a local comprehensive school as a student myself, and from there decided that history was my main love, really, in terms of subjects. So I studied modern history at Oxford, and from there went straight into teaching history. So a kind of love of history has been with me from very early on.
Really interesting. And then did you go straight from your undergraduate to becoming a history teacher in schools?
I did. So actually I stayed at Oxford, did my teacher training there, and then went on to teach in 3 different comprehensive schools in various places. Started out in a boys' comp in Hertfordshire and then moved to a big rural comp and then to an urban mixed comprehensive. So yeah, I loved working in schools, and to some extent, to be honest, I always feel that schools still are the place I feel most at home.
Absolutely. I agree. As someone who was a secondary teacher as well myself, I miss the buzz of the secondary schools. Absolutely. So do you mind me asking, what was it that drew you into academia and teacher education from the classroom?
Well, to some extent, it was a bit of good fortune, as a lot of things I think are in this respect. So I mentored trainee teachers when I was a head of history and really enjoyed that. And the opportunity came up to set up a brand new history PGCE. That's the main route to becoming a history teacher in secondary schools. And that was at the University of Warwick. So I heard about this opportunity and actually didn't intend to stay in academia. I thought I'll go do that for 2 or 3 years. That sounds like fun. And then I'll jump back into schools. And actually, the opportunities that offered to me were so great. You know, I had such varied opportunities and really enjoyed the diversity of that I stayed.
The pull of academia, yeah. I can understand that. And how did you find that transition from working with so many people every day in a school into academia, which is known to be a bit more working by yourself?
Yeah, it was tough, actually. And I think people who make that jump do often find that quite tough. And like I say, there are times when I still go into schools. I've never stopped going into schools because I go in to observe my students teach. And there are times when I just sort of walk into a school and it feels like home. So yeah, it was quite tough. And I remember the funniest thing really was that, of course, when you're an academic, you're in charge of your own time, right? So you don't have bells to tell you when you need to do X, Y, and Z. And if I had a day when I had nothing, no teaching or school visits, and therefore I could work at home. And you have to understand this is a very alien concept to me. I would phone whoever was sort of manning the PGC admin desks just to tell them that I was at home working. I was there if they needed me, because I just thought somehow they might think I'm not working because no one can watch. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts. I think I'd have been really happy to stay in schools and, continue my career in schools. It's just the way it's worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that freedom there with research and academia. But yes, there are pros and cons to that freedom, absolutely. And am I right that you completed your PhD in 2020?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, there were several points in my career when I could have done the PhD. When I was at Warwick, I decided after 5 years that I would pursue a different path and look at national policy around teacher development. So I moved to the training and development agency for schools as a program director. So I was there for 3 years. But, that pull of academia, which you talked about, kind of, it sort of reeled me back in. And then I got a post at IOE and had a number of roles there, including Director of Initial Teacher Education, as you said. But fundamentally, I ended up where I was at that point happiest, which was back in the world of history education. And it seemed the right time to do my PhD. I had a baby in the middle of doing it, so that extended.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So yes, finally finished it in the middle of lockdown, which brought its own kind of interesting moments. So I don't have a physical copy of my PhD because it wasn't required. So I actually don't have it sitting proudly on a shelf anywhere. But I'm really glad I did the PhD in the end. I met fantastic people. I really loved the work that I did. And that was looking at teachers across history, geography and physics. And it was really looking at what do teachers, really fantastic expert teachers, what do they know about their subject, about the knowledge that forms their subject, and about the pedagogy required to teach it. Well, what is it that they know? And I was really trying to get underneath that and compare that.
Oh, interesting. And how did you choose those 3 subjects to focus on as well?
That's a good question. Well, it had to be history because that's my subject. And I didn't want to choose 3 subjects that were so wildly different that there'd be no kind of common reference point at all. So geography was an obvious one to complement history. And physics, it seemed to me, was another way of explaining the world. So history, geography, physics are all involved in explaining the world in different ways. It helps that I'm married to a physicist too. So I thought, when I was getting my head around the physics, he'd be able to help me, which he did, which was very helpful.
Yeah. And as someone who's doing my own PhD now, so I'm lucky enough to have funding to do it full time, I was just wondering how you found that balance of working alongside it. And it sounds like maybe you were able to use the pandemic in the end to help you finish it because there were other things that maybe had stopped. How did you find that balancing?
Well, it was quite challenging. So, I had a young child and an older child. So I've got two kids. And so you're juggling your kind of day job and your parenting responsibilities and the PhD. I mean, I'm lucky because my contract gives me a day a week for my own scholarship and research. So I did have that time. And it was just about being sort of really savvy with my time in terms of blocking out chunks of time when I knew I had some writing to do or I had to do some data collection and prioritize that. I was also really lucky that I managed to get a term of study leave, and I actually went with my family across to New Zealand for 6 months. So I got a visiting lectureship at Victoria University in Wellington. And I was there for 6 months. And so I had kind of 3 days a week of just focusing on my data. And that was pretty important to me to get it done. But it was still really tough in the end. You still just have to get into the zone when you actually finish it and get the thing sort of fully written up. I went away for a couple of weeks and left my family to it and just completely focused on it 100%.
Yeah, it sounds like you developed those skills from when you first left the classroom and had to ring up the office to tell them you were working. You learned those skills to block it out. And that's so great that you got to travel to New Zealand as well. As you know, I'm speaking to you today from Canada. So that's one of the pulls of academia, definitely, the opportunity to travel. I was just going to ask about some of the findings from your PhD.
Well, I don't want to sound too technical when I answer this. So one of the things there's a lot of interest in at the moment are ideas of powerful knowledge. So what knowledge should we be teaching? What knowledge kind of counts? And how can we frame that in a way that makes it clear that knowledge is kind of provisional. It's just the best knowledge we have at any given time. It can be questioned and so on and so forth. So I was very engaged in those ideas. And sort of alongside that, there's a lot of interest in what happens when you take a disciplinary subject from the academy, if you like, and transfer it into a school context. So how similar to school history is academic history? How similar to school geography is academic geography? So I was kind of exploring both those ideas and thinking about what's the role of teachers in all of that. So how much agency do teachers have in what this thing called school history or school physics actually looks like? How much agency do they have? And traditionally, it hasn't been understood that they have much agency in some ways, that, maybe they are the kind of final players that just enact a curriculum or deliver a curriculum, and they haven't actually been making and shaping the curriculum themselves. So that's one of the things that I was really interested in, and how do they create powerful knowledge out of these school subjects? And I've very much found and I just looked at one expert teacher in each subject in real depth. So it was real case study research. And what I found was that in all three cases, they had considerable agency, because when you look at this from the perspective of a lesson, well, series of lessons in my case, but, just take one lesson, the number of decisions that teachers make in that lesson and what influences those decisions is, it's just a kind of huge capacity that teachers have to bring their knowledge and experience to bear on those decisions. So whilst the wider traditions of the subjects shape what they do, and the curriculums that they will be teaching, in some cases externally defined, particularly at GCSE, they'll be provided. Those decisions that they make in the lessons are informed by their overarching aims for their subject, their understanding of how their subject is structured, therefore what does progression look like, their understanding of the needs of the children with regard to their particular subject, their understanding of the repertoire of teaching strategies. And it's about orchestrating those, bringing all those together to inform those decisions. And I'm just kind of humbled really by the expertise that I was fortunate enough to research. And so the title of my thesis was about teachers as recontextualization agents. In other words, they're really active in turning this academic discipline into a school subject. They have a role to play.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And I can really see those two worlds that we talked about at the start, your experience in the classroom and now your research and teacher education coming together there. So I wanted to ask you more about, I know you're very interested in climate change, and with your background in history education, I wanted to ask, how do those two interests collide, and where did your interest in the environment stem from? Are those two things really related for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've always, as a history educator, felt that the starting point for deciding what we should teach kids in history, because there's so much history, right? So you have to make, quite brutal selections. The starting point in making those selections should be what would be helpful for people to have a historical perspective on in terms of the issues we're facing today, whether that's about issues of race, whether it's about issues of gender, or things like climate change. And if you look at research carried out with young people, and indeed with teachers actually, about why we study and teach history, the starting point ought to be something about, the world we live in now. So lots of things influenced me about this. So individuals, so Dr. Kate Hawkey at University of Bristol was talking about school history and climate change long before I was really engaged in it, and I was very influenced by her work. There was also a book called The History Manifesto, published nearly 10 years ago now. And in that, these two historians were basically saying, we're kind of losing the plot a little bit as academic historians, because what we need to be doing, we serve a public function, which is to help policymakers, to help, anyone really who's kind of making decisions. Our job is to give them a bigger perspective on the world today. And they said, look, politicians generally kind of reach back, maybe at best 50 years to find an analogy. And we need to help the public at large, really, set current issues into a wider context. So that influenced me. Kate's work influenced me. Being in New Zealand influenced me a lot. They're very engaged in issues around climate change and sustainability. They teach history as part of social studies over there. And there are swings and roundabouts to that. But what I found because I did a bit of research over there, talked to history teachers there, and they're quite nimble in changing their curriculum to respond to current issues. They don't have a national curriculum. In fact, they don't have any topics prescribed. Well, actually, that's going to change slightly because they are introducing a new history curriculum. But in recent years, they could teach what they like, and they've been able to be quite nimble about that. Yeah, I'm very interested and passionate about sustainability and climate change personally. And as a parent, I think that brings its own perspective too. And I'm very conscious of what my children are talking about and bringing home with them. So it was all those things together, really, that really made me interested in the role of school history through an environmental lens.
That's so interesting that you said about the purpose of the school subject is to learn more about our world now. Imagine that can be applied to every subject. That's so true, but I've not thought about it through that lens before. I used to teach French, and similarly, that would apply to that very clearly. So related to your work with that, I wanted to ask about the new Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education at UCL. So I know that you're Programme Director and that the Centre launched last month. So first of all, congratulations on the launch of the Centre, because I imagine there was a lot of work behind the scenes just to get to this point. Can you tell our listeners about the aims of the Centre and why it's needed now?
Absolutely. So about a year ago, I'd been involved in some small-scale projects around sustainability, particularly working with trainee teachers and talking with colleagues, reading a lot, thinking a lot about this. And it seemed to me that what didn't exist was a place where all teachers could go, regardless of the subject they teach, regardless of the age range they teach, regardless of their own career stage. My model was the Centre for Holocaust Education, which is also housed within IOE, and that's really been incredibly influential in transforming the way the Holocaust is taught in schools. And the model is, it's deceptively simple because there's a huge amount of work that sits behind it, but the model is basically go out and research what it is that teachers know, what it is that they don't know, what it is that they need. On the back of that, develop some really fantastically high quality support, which isn't just resources. That's a really important thing to say. It's not just about throwing more resources at people. There are lots of fabulous resources already out there about climate change and sustainability. We're not just wanting to replicate that. But what the Centre for Holocaust Education does, it actually mediates those resources by providing training. And it's all free. And, prior to the pandemic, that was mainly face-to-face. I think a lot of it now has shifted online. And I suspect, in the future, it'll be a mixture. And they've just kept their standards so high. So it's kind of a model for us in the quality of it. And they're constantly revising it. They're, building on more research. They've conducted more research since about student understanding of the Holocaust. They've branched out and they now have beacon schools. They have an MA module. They have a textbook and so on and so forth. But they've done it at a speed which has meant that it's high quality and that people trust it, and it's become something that people know is high quality. So it seemed to me to have something similar to that in this, huge interdisciplinary topic of climate change and sustainability would be something really worth having. It's massively ambitious, but the response we've had has been just fantastic. We haven't had a single person say to us, we don't need this. We've had an awful lot of people saying this is what we need.
Oh, I imagine. It sounds really needed, and I really respect that goal of not just resources. I think that's so important because you're right. Teachers have a wealth of worksheets and websites to access already. So the importance of training and speaking to teachers. Can I ask how you are working to link with teachers and whether you've got aims to work with teachers around the country or just within London at first?
It's another good question, Emily. So there's lots of different ways in which we want to talk to work with teachers and lots of other stakeholders, actually. So what we're doing is some case study research in 10 secondary schools around the country. So from Surrey to Yorkshire to Grimsby to Somerset and everything in between. So we're going out to these secondary schools, and that's really kind of an important phase for us, an important stage, I should say, in finding out what teachers are thinking. There is some survey data already available through organisations like Teach the Future, and that's been incredibly useful. But we want to dig a little bit deeper. And essentially, we want to understand schools holistically. My colleague, Professor Nicola Walsh, who's been so instrumental in helping to set this centre up and really pushing it forward, and she described the project as looking at schools as mini ecosystems. So what's the relationship between the head of geography and that person's vision and the head teacher and, a focus group of other teachers? And so we're really going to go in deep there with those 10 schools. So that's the first formal way in which we're reaching out to teachers. And that will be followed up with a very substantial national survey of teachers and school leaders. So that's the research side of it. We're also going to, from September, in a sense, pilot the process of developing these professional development materials and support in history and geography. And as part of that, we will be convening what we've called specialist advisory groups. So we will have one for history and one for geography, and it will be cross-phase. So we'll be recruiting primary teachers and secondary teachers. And as part of the launch of the centre, we invited people to sign up and register their interest. And we've had a lot of offers from teachers as well as other stakeholders, which is fantastic. So the voice of teachers is going to be incredibly important all the way through.
Yeah, that sounds really important. And yes, I imagine it's a challenge as well as an exciting thing to do, to link, like you said, across phases and across disciplines within schools, because it's not just an issue that affects geography education or just history education. It's across schools and across communities. And I imagine you're thinking about parents and families as well along the line.
We are, exactly.
Yeah.
And we actually commissioned an organisation, Public First, to carry out some polling of parents. It was part of our kind of proof of concept for the centre, and they ran some focus groups for us too. But we think it's the first time that parents have been polled about climate change in education for their children. And it was really interesting because what they said to us, out of a list of all kinds of things, which included mental health and Brexit and various things, they actually said that climate change and sustainability was the thing that our kids were most likely to be talking about at home. And what the parents also told us through the poll, overwhelmingly, they look to schools to support their children with this.
No, but because it's so cross-curriculum, it's not necessarily addressed in a really formal way, I imagine, in most schools.
Well, it is. So in some ways it is. So it is embedded within the national curriculum. So, you have to be looking at it in, for example, geography and science. But the fundamental premise of the centre is that the environmental challenges that we're facing impacts every part of our life. And therefore, it makes sense for this to be embedded in appropriate ways across the whole curriculum. Now, it's really, really important to say that doesn't mean we think kids should be taught about climate change all the time. That's not what we mean. The way this is framed is really important, because we don't want kids to have overload, repetition. We don't want them to switch off. We don't want to exacerbate their levels of anxiety. But we do think that there is, and we know because we've talked to colleagues in the Institute and we've read things, and we know that every subject has its own angle here. I'm currently involved in a project in initial teacher education with students across all subjects. And it's been really fascinating talking to the computing teachers and the music teachers and the business studies teachers and the modern linguists, as well as the geographers and the scientists and the historians, because they all have something to contribute. In particularly thinking about how can we live more sustainably, how can we express what we're feeling about this, how can we become activists. So it's not just about knowledge. Knowledge is important, and we need to understand the science of climate change and all of those things. And we need to understand how it's impacting people inequitably across the world. So there's all sorts of types of knowledge we need, but we also need to think about the skills that kids need to develop, to, the ways in which they can live their lives in the future, to be resilient to the impacts of climate change, and in a sense to also embrace the opportunities that living more sustainably may bring.
Yeah. Oh, well, it sounds like such a timely project, and I really look forward to hearing about what it achieves and the work you do going forward. I wanted to ask as well, Alison, about your Teach Climate History project. Could you tell our listeners about the aims of that project and how that's going to work?
Yes, of course. It's a fairly new project. I'm working on it with Michael Riley and Arthur Chapman from IOE, and then an ex-student of ours, Peter Langdon, who works in a local school. And the four of us are leading this project, which involves teachers, actually international, including someone from Canada, in fact, and South Africa, and across the UK and other places. So we've brought together this group of teachers and teacher educators, so people who do similar jobs to myself in other universities, because they've all expressed an interest in thinking about teaching school history through an environmental lens. And we're identifying, in fact, we've got a meeting today, and we're identifying the different ways of doing this in the classroom. And it's when you start to think about the potential, there's just so many. Peter, who's running the project with us, he planned a series of lessons which kickstarted this whole thing off really a couple of years ago. And he planned a series of lessons for year 7 students, so 12-year-olds. And the inquiry was, when did humans take over the world? Or something like that. I'm pretty sure that was the question. And he goes back to the beginning of humanity, and then takes it up to certainly the 1950s, pretty much up to the modern day, in about 7 hours. So that's one kind of big history approach, really inspired by what he's been reading around the Anthropocene. Then you could argue that there's scope here for some really, really small histories. So, just look at the history of your local area. Look at how that's changed kind of ecologically, how the management of the land has changed, how the landscape itself has changed. Just round the corner from you. So kind of much smaller history. Then you can teach so many of the topics that we usually teach in school. You can teach it through a kind of climate change environmental lens. So teach the Black Death through an environmental lens. You can look at the impact of the Little Ice Age and how that may have contributed to the high death rates. You can look at colonization. That's my particular interest at the moment, is looking at how, the process of settler colonialism led to just unbelievable scale of changes in the land and the way the land was managed. And a shift.
I imagine, yeah.
Yeah, and the shift to kind of indigenous ideas of land guardianship to a much more kind of Western notion of land ownership and the impact of that. So, that's a really rich kind of lens to bring. Not that we only want to teach environmental history, but alongside what we normally teach, just bear that in mind. And then predictable ones like the Industrial Revolution, and the Agrarian Revolution, which are 2 examples that we'll also be looking at. So we'll have groups of teachers and educators exploring each of these themes and thinking about what they'd actually look like in classrooms.
And do you have an aim to create resources or training for teachers from that, or is that still to be decided?
We wanted to have a practical outcome for sure. So the idea is to produce practical resources and ideas for teachers. But I very much hope that this group will also feed into the work of the centre. So history will be one of the subjects that we're focusing on from September. So there should be quite a lot of alignment there. And, that will be great if that happens.
It definitely sounds like there's a lot of links between all of your projects going on. So it sounds like you're really busy at the moment with the launch of the new centre and the Teach Climate History project. Have you got anything coming up in the future, any new projects that you're looking forward to?
Right now, I just want to get the centre up and running. We've got the case study research, which is going to take us up to the end of July. We've got the next national survey, which will certainly take us well into the autumn term. So, that's my priority really right now. And from September, getting work going on the history geography strands, and just listening to teachers and head teachers too, who are also really important stakeholders, and listening to children. So we will be getting an advisory group of children together as well to feed into the centre. So that's going to keep me busy, I think, for the next few years.
building that network for the centre. So I imagine in a year or two's time, it will look quite different from now. I imagine it's quite a small team at the moment.
It is a small team, yes. And as I think it's always the case with these things, when you have a good idea, you actually have to put a lot of work into it up front before you actually have any time. You've got to prove that it's viable and workable. And so particularly, and Nicola and I have been working really, really hard just to kind of get to this point. But we're really grateful for the support of IOE and UCL through funding and through support across UCL from academics in geography and science and history and psychology. And, we really want to bring in academics from across UCL to help with this because it is genuinely interdisciplinary. We want to make sure that everything we do is informed by the latest research. And it's really been pushing on an open door. We've just been really heartened by the positive response of UCL academics and also within IOE itself. And we're just really looking forward to it.
Well, congratulations again on the launch of this centre and all of the work that you've done to get to this stage. I really look forward to following the work of the centre in the future. And thank you again for being on the podcast. It's been really interesting to learn more about your research and also your career, but especially how your background as a school teacher has informed your work in academia, and you keep that link going forward through your work today, and you're helping other teachers and students and school communities with your work now. So I wish you all the best with your work going forward, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for having me.
You can follow Alison on Twitter at Alison Kitson too to learn more about her research. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, there's more where that came from in our archive of 15 past seasons. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts to find more episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as other podcasts from the IOE. And a quick favour before you go, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show. And that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such important work. I'm Emily. Thanks for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.